Welcome back to Air Quality Matters and One Take. One Take, my take on a paper or report on air quality, ventilation and the built environment. One Take in that it's well done in one take and tries to summarise for you a scientific perspective on something interesting in, well, usually 10 minutes or less, because who has the time to read all these amazing documents, right? This week, we're looking at a big, important paper from the Journal of Environmental Research. It's titled Mouldy Area Size and Asthma Symptoms Score and Control in Adults, the CONSTANCES cohort. It's by a team in France, and I think this one is really worth our time because it tackles a question that feels both incredibly obvious and surprisingly under-researched. We all know that mould in homes is bad, and we have a lot of evidence linking it to asthma, especially in children. But this paper asks a more subtle and perhaps more practical question. How much mould matters? Is there a difference between a few spots on a window frame and a large patch behind a wardrobe? And does the relationship hold true for adults? It's essentially asking about the dose-response relationship, but in a way that's very real-world. To answer this, the researchers did something pretty impressive. This isn't a small lab study or a survey of a few hundred people. They tapped into a massive ongoing public health study in France called the CONSTANCES cohort. This gave them access to an enormous pool of people. For this specific analysis, they included data from over 28,000 adults. That scale is what makes the findings so powerful and hard to ignore. The method was, on the face of it, quite simple. In 2019, they sent those participants a detailed questionnaire about their homes. They asked about things like visible mould and mouldy odours, but crucially, they didn't just ask a yes or no question. For visible mould, they asked people to estimate the size of the contaminated area. And to make this easier and more consistent, they gave them visual guidelines in the questionnaire. For example, explaining that a 0.2 square meters is about the size of 3 A4 sheets of paper, or that 1 square meter is about half of a door. This is a clever way to get a more granular, semi-quantitative data from a self-reported survey. People could categorize the mould in their homes from no mould to spots all the way up to an area greater than 3 square meters. Then, in the following years up to 2022, the same people completed another questionnaire, this time focused on their respiratory health. This asked about current asthma, specific asthma symptoms like wheezing or being woken up by shortness of breath, and how well controlled their asthma was using a standard tool called the asthma control test. This time lag between the two questionnaires is another strength of the study, as it helps separate the environmental exposure from the health outcome in time. So what did they find? Well, the results are pretty stark, and they paint a very clear picture. First, they found a very strong and significant association between the presence of any visible mould and having current asthma. Having a higher asthma symptom score and having uncontrolled asthma. People living with visible mould were about 40% more likely to have these issues. That's a big deal on its own. But the most important finding, the real headline here, is the dose-response relationship with mouldy area size. They found a clear, undeniable trend. The bigger the area of mould reported in a home, the higher the person's risk of having current asthma and the worse their asthma symptoms were. It's like climbing a ladder of risk. Each step up the mouldy area size from spots to less than 0.2 square meters and so on was associated with a further increase in risk. And here's the really crucial bit, the part that should make all of us sit up and pay attention. This increased risk wasn't just found in homes with massive wall coverings of mould infestations. The significant increase in risk started with the very smallest category they measured, just spots of mould. Even that small, seemingly minor amount was associated with a statistically significant increase in risk of having current asthma and worse symptoms compared to having no mould at all. They also found that the link was stronger when the mould was in the main living quarters, the bedroom and the living room. This makes perfect sense, right? It points to the importance of exposure duration. We spend most of our time in those spaces, particularly bedrooms, so mould there is likely to have a greater impact on our health. So to bring it all together, what this huge study tells us is that when it comes to mould and asthma in adults, size does matter. But perhaps more importantly, even a small size matters. This isn't a problem that only begins when you have a huge visible disaster on your hands. The risk begins with the very first spots. The implications of this is really significant. For social landlords and housing providers and building managers, this research reinforces that a little bit of mould is not an acceptable state. It's not just a cosmetic issue that can be put on a long-term maintenance list. The evidence here suggests it's an active health hazard from the moment it appears. For clinicians, doctors, nurses, respiratory specialists, it provides a strong evidence base for their advice. It suggests that when a patient presents with new or worsening asthma, asking, "Do you have any mould at home?" even a small amount, is a really important question. And for all of us, as occupants of buildings, it gives us the evidence to say that dealing with that little patch of mould in the corner of the bathroom isn't just about keeping the house nice, it's a genuine health intervention. The research really moves the conversation from a simple yes and no question of is there mould to a much more practical and urgent one. How do we get rid of all of it, no matter how small? Because the evidence from these 28,000 people is now clearer than ever that even a little bit can do harm. That's this week's episode of One Take. I hope you found it interesting. These podcasts aren't possible without our partners, Safe Traces and Imbiot, so thank you to them. See you next week.